The main task this week is creating the work breakdown structure. So the truth is we covered what a work breakdown structure was during estimation. A bit informally, I wanted you to get an idea for how do we break up work to do that estimation work. It was really important that you came up with specific numbers when you were doing your build versus buy decision. And doing a estimation breakdown using a work breakdown structure is a great tool to get to that point. There's a difference, though, between estimation and real project. In the estimation phase, we're not doing the project work at that point. We're just trying to size out the project work. So the granularity of what's going to be captured in that is very different than what we would expect when we get to the point of wanting to see an actual project. So when we get to the actual project, we have a nice framework in place for doing our planning. The process defines the structure of the plan, the way we'd be capturing information, as well as the type of activities that we're going to be working on, and the artifacts define the results of those activities. So it gives us a great structure for what we're going to build. Now, the structure itself isn't the whole answer to the problem. There's going to be many other pieces come in, but it's a great place to start. So there's some high-level phases that are being assigned. Now these high-level phases, the ones we see on the right here, are defined by the class. These aren't standard for IT projects. They're not all going to be there. It's not like every project you work on is going to have these 7 phases. But they're nice archetypical phases that you would go through in a development project. Depending on your process, you might go through them very differently. If you're doing an iterative project, it might be very different structure towards the way these things get planned out. But outside of the most extreme of project plannings, you will have some level of plan that comes along. You might not get to the same level of the WBS we'll show here because there might be some assumptions like, hey, when I do for example, a cycle, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And every time I do this cycle, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And so I don't need to spell X, Y, and Z out every time. I might just do it at like a sprint level. And so within a sprint, I know I'm going to do some design, some tests, some code, some other pieces that's going to go on inside of there. I don't necessarily have to go through each sprint and define the activities that's happening inside of it if you're taking like an agile approach. But that's okay. We still have these high-level phases that help us define. And so pay attention to the fact these will vary in your workplace, but they're what we're going to use for the project here. It's what we're expecting to see of the project here. So let's go through each one of these phases and talk about the types of tasks that you would see in that phase and how it's going to vary for your project. So the types of things you might see at the preliminary analysis phase is a charter defining what the project's going to be. You're going to go through all of your elicitation activities. How are you going to get that? Are you going to do JAD sessions? Are you going to have interviews? You're going to read some documents. It's the pre-planning stuff that's going to go on inside of here, as well as the project pre-planning stuff. So who's going to build schedules? When are they going to be due? What sort of process setups do we have? Some tailoring of the process, things that might come up along those lines, as well as initial budget and scoping activities. So your project needs to consider who are the sponsors of the project and how are you going to get details from those folks? How are you going to know what's going to happen? Or is there going to be big, long, all-day meetings? Are you going to have a series of phone conversations? What's the timeline for this process? Does it need to happen quickly, or should we take our time and really be able to define the project and grow it granularly, over time? Does it need to be waterfall and all happen up front, or is there a process by which I will come back every month or 3 months or whatever it's going to be and improve that? As well as at this point, you need to understand your process and how formal it's going to be and how is that going to drive the rest of the work that's going to be done. So the requirements activity isn't even the first activity. That first activity is getting us ready for the requirements. Based off of that, we're going to do the requirements, which might mean making some models, an analysis model, whether structured or object-oriented. It's going to be prepping this information to write the requirements. Again, we need to figure out the methodology. Are you doing use cases? In which case, I want to know what use cases. There's a login use case, there's a buy stuff use case, there's a sell stuff use case, there's a file a claim use case, there's a trade a player use case. These are the standard examples I've used throughout. But that's what we would expect to see at the work breakdown structure, not just write use case. We might have a bit more traditional requirements approach if you're taking that approach to say write requirements, but the better approach is you could say write requirements for admin site, write requirements for for the phone app, but you could break it down, say the iPhone app versus the Android app, or you could break it down even further and say write the security requirements for that, get into the non-functionals and things like that. It doesn't have to be ridiculously large for this class, but you might be more specific to be able to give you granularity. We'll talk about the scheduling and stuff like that a little bit later, but just want to get the idea that these things should be specific to your project. So what process are you using to capture requirements, and what are the main features of your project? I can't look at a project schedule and apply it to any project. If that was the case, I'd just teach you that project schedule. But we want to know for your project, what are you building? Are you selling pizza, or are you out there to change the world with some new robotic software that does something else? The projects are going to be very different based off of that. Moving in the design phase, it starts to be easier to define the types of tasks, but the tasks get more specific. There's an architecture task, maybe some breakdown of how you do bits of architecture, but then in design. But the design task is going to be designing what? Each component. I need to design a database. That could be a component that's out there, or more likely it's going to be tied to your project. It could be components like database or web services or something like that. More likely it's going to be, I'm going to design the features for managing inventory. I'm going to design the features for reporting on sales. Something along those lines. But there could be security views or other special views inside of there as well. All through this, and I didn't really call it out in all the rest of them, you should always consider reviews. When you get to the design, the whole point of design is to have somebody review it. If you don't have review tasks out there, why are you doing design? If you're not sharing that information, collaborating with somebody else, if I'm just doing the design for my own work, we'll just roll it into go build this thing. I mean, I don't ask you to turn in the time you're spending watching these videos. That's just something you do to get ready for the work you're going to do. But I do grade your work. That's my review of that. If I wasn't going to grade your work, you might as well assign yourself a grade and be done with it, right? So we want to document the reviews in particular at design, but probably all the way along, requirements and everything else that's going to happen here. And we'll see reviews show up on almost every one of these slides. So for your project, what are the big system breaks down and what methodology you're using? Consider those when you come up with the specific design tasks that are going to be created. Now, the development side, you're going to implement stuff. It's the same sort of thing. You're going to code, you're going to configure, you're going to customize, you're going to install, you're going to unit test. You're going to review these things possibly. The code reviews, I am a fan of code reviews, but not from a quality standpoint, but from a maintainability, a supportability, that sort of stuff. I want to look for intangible things. Not did I meet the requirements, that's why I test it, but more so, is this good code that is spelled right and follows coding standards and things like that. So for your project, did you decide to build or buy this? What are the design pieces you're building or buying? And then how are you going to test this stuff? Does it need to be integration tested? Is this something development's going to do? Is it unit testing going to happen? These are the things you want to be able to answer as part of your plan for your deployment. The next one is integration and testing. The integration, again, might be part of the previous phase. It could be part of this phase. This is all the stuff we talked about from phase 3. That's the bottom line here, but I just throw it out there right away. So it's your test planning, your test cases, your reviews of those test plans and test cases. When you get to the point, you got to execute them. So you would not only say, hey, I'm going to write a test plan, but then I'm going to write a test case to deal with login, write a test case to deal with purchasing, write a test case to deal with returns. And then I'll have a phase that go off and execute the test cases. I don't need to know necessarily when each one's going to be executed, but I'd like a step. I'm going to do unit testing now. I'm going to do system testing now. Do whatever testing you have scheduled now, and then generate reports off of that. Remember, the artifacts are important. I don't just test. I want to report on what I did for my testing. And you got to consider we're going to do this over multiple phases. So what does your test plan say? The stuff you did in phase 3. Am I doing a single phase of testing, or am I doing system testing and then unit testing? I'm sorry, then integration testing, then the performance testing. And then there might be many cycles in that. I might be doing a couple different cycles where I do 2 rounds of system testing just to make sure I get it after bugs are fixed. So that's the type of stuff that's going to show up in the testing. Again, much of this is driven by the test plan. So you can reuse some of the stuff from your test plan before, just have it show up in the work breakdown structure. That's a great way of being able to get this task done. Next thing here, user acceptance, installation and deployment. So within your user acceptance, you're going to test, you're going to execute it, and you're going to sign it off. There should be 2 bullets. I don't know why there's not a dot in there. Sorry about that. But then you're going to be doing your release stuff. Now, the acceptance is maybe part of your test plan. There's a little bit of overlap on some of these based off the process. But in your release, what is your plan for your release? How do you have approvals for that plan? You're going to have to do sign-offs for when the product is ready to go. Sometimes you don't want to just say, hey, we think we're done. You want to actually go to executive and say, are you ready to release this stuff? So then how do I execute the release, and then do I test afterwards? Now, there's a lot to consider here. Your test plan is part of this. Your process is part of this. The organization is part of this. You have to consider all those pieces because you have to understand what is the product you're delivering. Do I deliver software in the sense that I burn a CD and ship it to stores? Do I update servers like on websites that's going to then all of a sudden it's going to be live based off of when I deliver to the server? Is this downloaded software like, again, phone applications that people will install at their leisure? Not everybody moves over at once. So delivered products have to have a certain quality because if they're not right, I have to patch it, which is expensive, or I have to recall and reissue CDs. Downloaded software, again, might have to have versions that go out. And are we ready to deliver this version, and questions like that. So those plans are going to vary based off of where is this thing going? How do users acquire it and use it? And so the last quote-unquote phase, which is really a very long-standing phase, is the support and maintenance, where there's both technical and people processes to worry about here. So the technical processes is how do I deal with patches and archiving and care and feeding the application. So patches could be fixes to the project, bug fixes that come up later on, but also the question of operating system patches, database patches that might come up, applications you're using, vendor application package that come up. Who's going to be responsible for them? When do they get installed? What's the outage windows for that? Do we have that stuff in play and planned for? Archiving of data when my log file fills up that folder, where do I put the logs? Do I delete them? Do I store them on some sort of backup drive? These are all important things to consider for your long-term support planning. But then we also have to support people. Who's going to handle calls? Who's going to troubleshoot the system? Who's going to do the training for people to do those things up front? I know the organization I work in, we have an entirely different team that does support than that does development. The good news about that is the developers can always be focused on the next features. The bad news about that is we have to have a whole training cycle in getting the support people to be aware of what we released. How did it change? How do they debug and support these things that happen? And so we need to understand what's the follow-on. Is there things from this project that are going to be implemented later that other projects need to know about, that I need to be able to pass along or get prepared? Or there's configuration options or things like that that have to be understood. And then for our project, are we going to go back and do a post-mortem? Look at what we did well, what we did poorly, how do we learn from that? That's something else that might show up on your project plan. So again, consider the nature of the product you're delivering. If I get a phone call, can I just make a change on a server, or do I have to have the user reinstall something new? If it's a phone application, maybe there's a whole different connotation to that. Like there could be environmental things that are going on, the version of the phone people have. So we might have to be highly trained in figuring out how we even get to the point of what's wrong. And so we need to figure out all those pieces. Now, the final product that you're going to be producing is a mix of all these things. We have the standard activities, the high-level phases we talked about. But then there's the process that you chose and how it varies inside of there. You might have a waterfall, you might have an iterative process. So that's going to change the way the work breakdown structure is set up. You might be going and having multiple requirement cycles. It could be the same tasks, just arranged differently. And it's always going to mix in with the details of the project you're building. Whatever your product is, it's going to vary what the answer's here. So you need to take all three of these things to create your work breakdown structure. And even if you did the same project again 6 months from now, it'd probably be different because you might have a different mix. The standard activities would be the same, but the process might even be the same, but the details of what you're building might change slightly. So you got to consider that because these things are highly customized and focused for a point in time.